The morning sun had not yet risen when the first cry echoed through the valley. It wasn't the sound of a bird or the wind threading through the papyrus reeds. It was sharper, roar like the earth itself calling for help. The river that cut through the heart of the small African village was still cloaked in a sleepy mist, its ripples catching the faintest touch of dawn. Somewhere along that fog-covered shore, a woman named Abina stopped dead in her tracks, her clay pot balanced on her hip, her breath hanging in the chill air. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of the wind, perhaps, or the echo of a dream she hadn't yet shaken off. But then it came again often now, but unmistakable. A baby, crying, out here, where no baby should be. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, sandals scraping against the damp earth as she followed the sound. Each step brought with it a rising sense of dread, but also something else, a pull she couldn't explain, a whisper inside her telling her she had to find it. The reeds were thick near the bend, where the water slowed and deepened. She pushed through them, her hands trembling as she parted the last curtain of green, and there he was, a small bundle of faded cloth, floating gently near the bank, caught on a branch, as if the river itself had decided to spare him. His cries were weak now, fading in and out like the flicker of a dying flame. For a long moment Abina just stared, unable to move. It felt like time itself had stopped around her. When she finally reached out, the water was colder than she expected. It bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She lifted the child with both hands, pulling him close, her heart pounding as if it would burst. The boy was tiny, his face scrunched, his lips trembling from the chill. His skin was the color of wet clay, smooth, fragile, and perfect. She could see the veins beneath, pulsing faintly. He couldn't have been more than a few days old. There was no mark of who he belonged to, no bracelet, no blanket with a name, nothing. Only the river dot behind her. The world began to stir. The first calls of women heading to the water for their morning chores drifted through the air, and Abina knew she couldn't stay long. If others found out, they'd talk. They always did. A child found by the river. In their village, that meant bad luck. A curse. Some would say the spirits had sent him as punishment. Others might say he was not a child at all, but something else's spirit in human form, testing them. Abina didn't believe in curses. But even so, she felt the weight of eyes she couldn't see. She wrapped the baby in her shawl, tucking him against her chest to shield him from the cold. He stopped crying then, as if sensing he was safe, or perhaps simply too tired to continue. His small body fit perfectly against her heart, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. She had no husband, no children of her own. Life had passed her by in quiet ways, years marked by planting seasons and funerals. But now, with this fragile life in her arms, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, purpose. When she reached her hut at the edge of the village, the sun had finally broken through the horizon. Golden light spilled over the mud walls and flickered through the doorway as she laid the baby down on a woven mat. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. She could hear her own heartbeat, the rustle of leaves outside, the slow trickle of water from her pot. She had no milk to give, no plan, no idea what she was supposed to do, only instinct. She heated some goat's milk and fed him from a piece of cloth, drop by drop, praying it would be enough. As the day stretched on, word began to spread. A neighbor had seen her return from the river with something wrapped in cloth. By noon, 2 women appeared at her door, their faces painted with curiosity and judgment. "Abina," one whispered, peering inside. "What have you done?" Abina turned to face them, her voice calm but firm. "He was alone, crying. I couldn't leave him." The women exchanged glances. "You know what they'll say. You should take him to the chief." But Abina only shook her head. "He's mine now," she said quietly. "The river gave him to me." That night, as darkness fell, and the cicadas began their chorus, Abina sat beside the small fire in her hut. The baby slept wrapped in cloth near the flames, his tiny chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm. Outside, the wind carried the sound of drums from the village-centered estate, mournful, almost like the heartbeat of the land itself. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire on her face, and whispered, "You will live." The words were more than a promise. They were a prayer. Days turned into weeks. Against all odds, the baby grew stronger. His cries became louder, his eyes brighter. He laughed for the first time one morning, when a rooster crowed too close to the door. Abina had never heard a sound so pure, but not everyone shared her joy. Some villagers refused to visit her now. Children were told not to play near her home. Rumors spread like wildfire that she had taken in a cursed child, that bad omens would follow. Even the local healer warned her to take the boy to the river and leave him there again, to let the spirits decide. But Abina refused. She would not return him. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw something ancient and knowing, like the river itself had chosen her for this purpose. You came from the water, she would whisper to him, but you belong to the earth now. She named him Kofi, meaning born on Friday, though she had no idea which day he was truly born. The name felt right. Months passed, the seasons changed. The river that had once been her quiet companion now felt like a secret she carried alone. Sometimes she would walk there at dusk, standing on the same bank where she had found him. The water would shimmer beneath the fading light, calm and endless, and in those moments she would feel a strange connection, as if the river watched her, silently approving, guarding them both. But other times, when the wind rose and the sky darkened, she would hear it again, the faint sound of crying carried through the reeds, and she would clutch Kofi tighter, her heart pounding, praying it was only her imagination. Years later, she would still remember that sound, the way it had cut through the morning mist, the way it had changed everything. But for now, she only knew one thing, that the boy she found that day was not meant to die. The river had given him back, and in return, she would give him everything she had, even if the world turned against her. The days in the village began to flow around Abina and the boy, like the river itself, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce, but always moving forward. Kofi grew quickly, and with each passing moon, his laughter filled the air of her small hut. He was the child of whispers, the boy people avoided when they thought no one was watching. Yet, for Abina, he was light in human form. She would watch him chase grasshoppers through the tall grass, his bare feet kicking up dust, and for a few moments, she'd forget the way people looked at them. But the world around them had not forgotten. The elders still spoke in low tones when she passed. Some would turn away entirely, clutching charms and muttering prayers to ward off spirits. Others simply watched, their eyes full of something she could not name, pity perhaps, or fear. When the harvest season came, Abina was the only one left to work her portion of the fields. No one wanted to share her tools or her baskets. She said nothing. She had endured worse than loneliness. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and painted the sky a deep crimson, a knock came at her door. It was the village chief, a tall man with a face carved by time and authority. His eyes held the kind of sadness that came from knowing more than he ever wanted to. "Abina," he said quietly, stepping inside, "you know why I'm here." She nodded, though her hands trembled. He looked down at Kofi, who was sitting by the fire, playing with a small carved lion. "The council believes the boy is not meant to stay." Her heart tightened. "He's just a child," she said. The chief sighed, "Perhaps, but there are signs. Since he came, the rains have not been kind. The river floods when it shouldn't. People are afraid." Abina's voice cracked. "So you would have me leave him, let him die?" The chief hesitated, then shook his head. "There are other places, a mission across the forest. The white man there takes in abandoned children. They will feed him, teach him. It may be the only way." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them, casting their faces in shifting light. Then the chief placed a small pouch on the mat. "For the journey," he said, "if you choose to go." And with that, he left, leaving the faint scent of smoke and authority behind. Abina stared at the pouch, then at Kofi, who was humming softly, unaware of the storm that had begun to build around his small life. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the door, watching the shadows move across the floor as the wind whispered through the cracks. What did it mean to be a mother? To protect a child, not of her blood, not even of her destiny? The answer came quietly, without words. She remembered the first time she'd held him, wet and shivering, a tiny life between her hands. The choice had already been made that morning by the river. She could not undo it now. When dawn came, she packed what little she had, dried yams, a calabash of water, a woven shawl. She lifted Kofi onto her back and began the long walk toward the forest. The path was narrow, winding through tall grass and termite mounds, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. For miles, they walked in silence, the only sound their footsteps, and the rustle of distant birds. Once, she stopped to rest by a tree, tracing her fingers over its bark. "We're almost there," she whispered, though she didn't truly know where there was. By midday, the forest opened into a clearing. Smoke curled from the chimneys of a small mission compounda, handful of clay buildings, surrounded by a wooden fence. The sound of children playing reached her ears, laughter carried on the breeze. For a brief moment, she felt hope. Maybe the chief was right. Maybe this was a chance for Kofi to have more than she could ever give. A life free of whispers, a life that didn't begin with a curse. A tall man in a worn white shirt stepped forward to greet her. His accent was heavy, his smile kind but distant. "You have come far," he said. Abina nodded, clutching the boy tighter. "I heard you take in children." He studied Kofi for a moment, then gestured toward the gate. "Yes, we do what we can. There is food, lessons, shelter. You are welcome to stay for the night." Inside, the air smelled of smoke and soap. The children wore faded clothes, but their eyes shone with a quiet brightness. It felt strange, unreal, like another world altogether. That night, Abina watched Kofi sleep among the other children, his tiny hand resting against his cheek. The missionary approached her quietly. "He is strong," he said softly. "He will do well here." She turned to him. "Will you care for him?" He nodded, as if he were my own. She wanted to believe him, but as she looked around at the neat beds, the strange wooden cross above the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving a piece of her soul behind. At dawn, before anyone woke, she rose from her mat and went to him. The light of morning had barely touched his face, yet she could see every line, every breath. She brushed her fingers through his hair and whispered, "You are my son, no matter what they say." Then she turned and walked away, her shawl trailing behind her like a shadow she could never lose. The forest was colder that morning. The mist had returned, curling around her feet as she crossed the narrow bridge back toward the village. Behind her, the sound of children's voices grew faint, then disappeared entirely. She didn't look back, not once. But as the first rays of sunlight pierced the trees, she thought she heard something, a soft cry carried on the wind. Not of pain, but of longing. The same sound she had heard years ago by the river. Only this time, it was her heart that cried. Back in the village, life went on as if nothing had changed. The women laughed at the wells. Men traded stories under the baobab tree. Yet for Abina, everything felt hollow. Her hut seemed larger, emptier. The sound of silence pressed against her ears like a weight. At night, she would wake expecting to hear his breathing, the soft rustle of his small body turning in sleep. But there was only the wind, whispering through the reeds outside. And though she tried to move onto plant to sing, to smile, the river never let her forget. Every time she went to fetch water, she felt its pull. The same current that had once delivered a child to her feet now seemed to mock her with its endless flow. "You gave him away," it seemed to say. "You gave away what was meant to be yours." But fate, as the old stories say, is not a river you can step into once and leave behind. It bends, it circles, it finds you again. And even as Abina carried on with her quiet life, the water had already begun to move differently beneath the surface, carrying secrets, carrying memories, carrying a name that would one day be spoken far beyond that small village, across nations and screens, and would find its way back to her once more. The mission stood on the edge of the forest like a forgotten outpost of hope, half sanctuary, half orphanage, built from sun-bleached clay and timber that creaked in the night. The air there always smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and the sound of bells marked the passing of each day. Kofi was too young to remember the woman who had brought him there, too young to know the story of the river or the choices that had been made in his name. All he knew was the rhythm of the bell, the faces of strangers, and the strange ache that sometimes visited him in his dreams. He grew up among other children like himself, foundlings, wanderers, the forgotten. The missionaries gave them names, taught them to pray, to read, to work. "God has a plan for each of you," Father Thomas would say, his deep voice echoing off the stone walls. But Kofi always wondered whose plan it really was, God's or the river's. Some nights he would sit alone by the fence, listening to the murmur of the forest beyond. The wind would rush through the trees like a sigh, and for a fleeting moment, he'd swear he could hear someone calling his name in the distance. The years that followed were hard, but steady. He became strong, stronger than most. When food was scarce, he learned to share. When the older boys teased him for the scar on his wrist, the one he didn't remember getting, he said nothing. He had learned early that silence could be a shield. Still, there was something in him that set him apart. The others called him the river boy, half in jest, half in fear. There was a wildness in his eyes, a calm that could turn storm in an instant. Father Thomas saw it too. "You have a restless spirit," he once told him, handing him a worn Bible. Perhaps the Lord has something greater in mind for you. But Kofi didn't care for sermons. He was drawn to stories instead, old ones whispered by the cooks and the field hands when they thought no one was listening. Stories of spirits that lived in rivers, of ancestors who took human form, of children who came from water and returned to it when their time was done. He listened to every word, storing them in the quiet corners of his mind like secret treasures. When he turned 12, the mission sent him to the nearby town to study. It was the first time he'd seen cars, electricity, the bustling chaos of people who didn't know his name or his story. Everything felt too fast, too loud. Yet within that chaos, he found something new: possibility. He excelled in his lessons, not because he loved books, but because he had learned the value of survival. Every page, every word, was a step further from the whispers that had once followed him. Still, the nights were the hardest. Sometimes he would wake from dreams so vivid they left his hands trembling. Dreams of water and voices, of a woman's face he could never quite see. She was always reaching for him, calling to him, her voice breaking like light on the surface of a river. He would sit up in bed, heart pounding, wondering if she was real, or just the echo of a memory his soul refused to forget. When he turned 16, Father Thomas passed away. The mission fell silent for days, the children moving through the halls like ghosts. For Kofi, the loss felt strange, not sharp, but hollow. The man who had once been his guardian had become another shadow in a life already full of them. He began to drift, working odd jobs in town, sleeping where he could. Yet, even as the years hardened him, there was something about his eyes that never changed. That same deep calm, that same hidden pull toward something unseen. One day, a journalist from the city arrived at the old mission. She was documenting stories of the children who had grown up there, what had become of them, where they had gone. When she met Kofi, now 18, tall and lean, she was struck by the quiet confidence in his voice. "You speak like someone who's been through storms," she said with a smile. Kofi shrugged. "The river teaches you how to survive." She didn't understand the weight of that sentence, but she wrote it down anyway. Her article went viral weeks later. Among the many faces of lost children and survivors, his photo stood out, a young man with dark eyes and a soft half-smile, standing before the ruins of the mission school. People called him the River Orphan. Donations poured in, and a charity offered him a scholarship to study journalism in the city. The irony wasn't lost on him that a stranger's curiosity would open the doors to the very world that had once been closed to him. In the city, everything changed. The noise, the light, the rush, it swallowed him whole. Yet, instead of drowning, he learned to swim. He spoke well, thought fast, and listened deeply. By his early 20s, he was already working for a national broadcaster. His voice now the one telling stories instead of being part of one. But sometimes, between interviews or late-night broadcasts, he would pause, staring at the reflection of his face in the studio glass. There were moments when he didn't recognize the man staring back, polished, confident, respected, and beneath it all, the faint hum of the river still called to him. He told himself he would return one day, just once, to the village where his story began. But time had a way of softening promises. The world had opened its arms to him, and he let it. The child who shouldn't have lived had become a man the world wanted to hear. Yet, even success couldn't quiet the ache inside him, the sense that something, or someone, was missing. Meanwhile, far from the glitter of the city lights, an older woman sat by the same river that had once brought her both pain and purpose. Abina's hair had turned silver, her back bent with years of labor. Still, she came every morning, her reflection trembling in the current. Sometimes she spoke to the water. Sometimes she sang. "Do you still remember me?" she would ask softly, though she didn't expect an answer. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, Kofi would wake with tears on his face, unsure why. The world moves in circles. The old people say, what is lost must one day find its way home. Neither Abina nor Kofi knew it yet, but the river was stirring again. The same current that had carried him to her arms once was now carrying him back, not as a helpless child, but as a voice that would soon echo across an entire nation. And when that moment came, the past and the present would meet in a way neither could have imagined. The rain had been falling for days. In the city it came down not in gentle drops but in torrents that washed the streets and blurred the skyline into a gray watercolor. Kofi sat by the window of his small apartment, watching the world dissolve behind a curtain of water. It was strange, he thought, how rain could make a city that never slept feel suddenly still. Somewhere below, car horns echoed like distant thunder, but inside, there was only quiet. He had finished his late-night news segment hours ago, yet his mind refused to rest. Lately, his dreams had become heavier, fragments of places he couldn't name, faces that vanished when he tried to remember them. Always, there was water. Always, the river. On his desk sat an old photograph, curled at the edges, one taken years ago, at the mission school. A group of children lined up in front of a clay building, smiling awkwardly. Behind them, Father Thomas stood tall, his hand resting gently on Kofi's shoulder. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, "The boy from the river." He didn't know who had written it, but the words had always unsettled him. Sometimes he wondered if the story he'd been told about his birth, that he had been left at the mission gate by travelers, was true. Something about it had never felt right. He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the city blending with the rain. "Where did I come from?" he whispered to no one. The question had no answer, not yet, but somewhere deep in his chest, something stirred, a longing that felt older than he was. The kind of longing that couldn't be explained by words, only by the quiet ache that sometimes came when he heard the sound of rushing water. At the same time, miles away in the village, Abina felt the change too. The air was heavy, restless. The river had swollen from the rains, its banks trembling as though holding a secret. She stood by the edge, her shawl soaked through, her hands folded around the wooden carving of a child she had made years ago. "It's been 20 years, she murmured. "If you're still alive, let the river carry my words to you." Her voice cracked in the wind, but she didn't stop. "I never forgot. Not a single day." She had grown quieter with the years, her laughter long gone, her friends fewer. The younger women of the village whispered about her still, calling her the river woman. Some said she spoke to spirits. Others pitied her, but Abina didn't care. She had loved once, and that love had not faded with time. It had only changed shape, turning from fire to ember, from ache to prayer. One night, as the storm broke and thunder rolled across the valley, Abina dreamed again. She saw a face, older now, sharper, but the eyes were the same. They looked at her through a screen, a rectangle of light she didn't understand. "Mother," the voice said. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. It was just a dream, she told herself, but something in her knew better. The following week, Kofi was assigned to a new story, a documentary on forgotten villages of the coast, a feature highlighting resilience and local folklore. When he received the itinerary, his eyes caught on one name, a small village by a river whose name he didn't recognize, yet it felt strangely familiar. He couldn't explain it, but his hands trembled as he traced the word. It was as if the paper itself was alive, calling to him. "Are you all right?" his producer asked, glancing over. Kofi forced a smile. "Yeah, just feels like I've seen this place before." The drive to the village took 2 days, through dirt roads and forests that whispered with rain. As the car bumped along, Kofi gazed out at the passing landscape, the red soil, the distant hills, the winding rivers that glistened like veins of silver. The smell of wet earth filled the air, awakening something buried deep inside him. When they finally arrived, he stepped out of the vehicle and stood still, letting the wind brush against his face. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was recognition. His heart knew this place, even if his mind did not. The village hadn't changed much in decades. Mud huts leaned slightly with age, children ran barefoot through puddles, and the same songs floated from the elders' fires. As the crew set up their equipment, Kofi wandered off toward the river. The sound of the water reached him long before he saw it, the same low hum that had haunted his dreams for years. When he reached the bank, the world seemed to blur. The mist, the reeds, the smell of rain, everything felt exactly as it had in the fragments of his memory. He knelt by the edge and touched the surface with his fingers. The water was cold, but it didn't sting. It welcomed him. Behind him, a voice spoke softly. "The river remembers, you know." Kofi turned. An old woman stood a few steps away, her frame thin but steady, her eyes sharp despite their years. There was something about her face, something that made his chest tighten. "You must be from the city," she said. "We don't see many like you here." Kofi smiled faintly. "I'm making a film," he said, "about places like this, stories people forget." The woman nodded. "Stories never forget us," she murmured. "We are the ones who forget them." He laughed softly, but the sound caught in his throat. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Abina," she said finally, "but most people here just call me the river woman." The name hit him like a current, pulling from beneath. For a moment, the world around him went silent. The rain, the camera crew, the hum of the water, everything disappeared. Only that name remained, echoing through him like a voice from long ago. Abina studied his face, her brow furrowing. "You look familiar," she said. "Have we met before?" Kofi shook his head, though his heart was pounding. "No, I don't think so." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. There was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, a recognition he couldn't explain. They stood there in silence for a long moment, two souls bound by a secret neither yet understood. When the rain began to fall again, Abina invited him to her hut for shelter. The walls were lined with wooden carvings, faces, animals, shapes of the river. One small figure sat apart, carved with delicate care, a baby wrapped in cloth. "You made this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Many years ago." Her voice trembled slightly. "It helps me remember." Kofi reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing the rough surface of the wood. For an instant, he felt warmth, not from the fire, but from something deeper, like the memory of being held. The air grew still between them. Abina's eyes glistened as she looked at him, her lips parting, as if to speak, but the words refused to come. The past was stirring, but the truth wasn't ready to surface. Not yet. Outside, the river roared louder than before, its voice rising like a heartbeat that had waited 20 years to be heard. And somewhere within that sound, if one listened closely enough, there was the faintest echo of a child's cry. Not of sorrow this time, but of return. That night, the storm came without warning. The sky cracked open in flashes of white fire, and thunder rolled over the hills like an ancient drum. In Abina's small hut, the rain drummed against the thatched roof with a fury that made the walls tremble. Kofi sat near the hearth, staring into the flames as the old woman moved quietly in the shadows, wrapping clay pots with cloth to keep them from breaking. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the room, painting her face in silver light, and every time, he would see something new in her expression. A question, a memory, a fear. When the wind howled harder, she sat across from him, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "The river doesn't sleep," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the fire. "It remembers everything, even the things we wish it would forget." Kofi didn't respond at first. He felt the words more than he understood them. "You talk about it as if it's alive," he said finally. Abina smiled faintly. "It is. You can't live beside something that gives and takes lives and not feel its breath." The fire flickered, casting their shadows across the wall. Outside, the rain fell heavier, merging with the river until the two became one endless sound. Abina's gaze drifted to the small wooden carving on the shelf, the child wrapped in cloth, the same one Kofi had touched earlier. "I made that a long time ago," she said, almost to herself. "For someone I lost. The river took him, and I never saw him again." Her words landed softly, but in Kofi's chest, something shifted. He leaned forward, his voice low. "How long ago?" She hesitated, staring into the fire as if searching for the answer there. 20 years, she said finally. It was a Friday morning. The words struck him like thunder. Friday. The name Kofi meant, born on Friday. He had never known why Father Thomas chose it for him. Or perhaps, he thought now, someone else had. Lightning flashed again, and for an instant, the room seemed to freeze in the electric glow. Kofi's heartbeat quickened. He felt dizzy, his thoughts scattering like ash. What happened to him? He asked quietly. Abina's hands trembled around her shawl. "I found him by the river," she whispered. "Alone, crying. The water had brought him to me. I raised him for as long as I could, but the village said he was cursed. They made me take him away. I left him at a mission beyond the forest." The silence that followed was heavy, alive. The air itself seemed to listen. Kofi's breath caught in his throat, his eyes fixed on her face. "A mission," he murmured. His mind raced back. The clay walls, the bells, the cross above the door. It couldn't be coincidence. "What was the child's name?" he asked, his voice breaking. Abina's lips parted, trembling. "Kofi," she said. "I called him Kofi." The room swayed. He felt the ground tilt beneath him, the air closing in. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Kofi stood, his eyes glistening in the firelight. "I think," he whispered, "you found me." Abina's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No," she murmured. "No, it can't be." But when he looked at her, truly looked, she saw it. The curve of his jaw, the mark on his wrist, the same one she had once kissed as a baby. She reached for him with trembling hands. "Kofi," she whispered, as if afraid the name might break him. He nodded, unable to speak. For a long moment, the storm outside roared, while inside the small hut, the world held its breath. Abina moved closer, her fingers brushing his cheek as though she feared he might vanish if she touched him too roughly. "My son," she whispered, her voice breaking, "the river gave you to me, and it gave you back." Kofi's chest heaved as tears finally spilled down his face. He sank to his knees beside her, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding him as if trying to make up for all the years she had lost. The storm raged, thunder shaking the earth, but inside, time stood still. 20 years of silence, of wondering, of longing, all collapsing into one moment of impossible truth. When the rain began to ease, Kofi pulled back, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was abandoned," he said. "They told me I was left at the gate, that no one wanted me." Abina shook her head fiercely. "I never wanted to leave you. They made me. They said you would die if you stayed. I thought I was saving you." Her tears fell freely now, and Kofi caught her hand, pressing it against his heart. "You did," he said. "You saved me." They sat together until dawn, the fire reduced to glowing embers. When the light finally crept through the cracks in the roof, Abina looked at him with wonder, as though seeing the child she once held, grown into a man she could barely recognize. "You came back," she said softly. "After all this time." Kofi smiled, through his tears. Maybe the river decided it was time. Word of the stranger's visit spread quickly through the village. By midday, the neighbors gathered near the hut, whispering, peering through the doorway. Some recognized the old carving in Kofi's hand, others murmured about fate and forgiveness. But for Abina, none of that mattered. She had her son. That was enough. As the sun rose higher, Kofi stepped outside and looked toward the river. It was calm again, its surface smooth as glass. He could see his reflection, not the journalist, not the public figure, but the boy who once floated on its current, carried from death to destiny. "I came from this," he whispered, "and I returned to it." Behind him, Abina's voice called softly, "The river doesn't take what belongs to it. It only keeps it safe until the time is right." Later, when he returned to the city, the story spread beyond the village, beyond the country. News channels called it the River Miracle. Interviews poured in, requests for appearances, headlines declaring the impossible reunion. But on the night of his live broadcast, when the host asked him what he would like to say to the world, Kofi simply smiled and looked into the camera. "To the woman who found me," he said, his voice steady but trembling with emotion. "You called me your son before anyone else did. You taught me that love doesn't begin with blood, it begins with mercy. So tonight, I call you what I should have called you long ago." He paused, his throat tightening as millions watched. "Mother." In that moment, across villages and cities, across screens and hearts, silence fell, the kind of silence that only truth can create. And somewhere by the river, in a hut where the rain had just begun again, Abina pressed her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The water outside whispered softly, carrying his voice through the reeds. The river had returned what it borrowed. The circle was complete. But if you listened closely, beyond the sound of rain and wind, there was something else. The faint, steady murmur of water meeting earth, life meeting life, love returning home. The river remembered. It always did. The world had changed for Kofi overnight. One moment he was another television journalist, respected but ordinary. The next, he was a symbol. Newspapers called it the River Sun Miracle. Talk shows replayed the moment he called her mother, their voices trembling as they described it. There were headlines that spoke of fate, destiny, even divine intervention. He became the story he once would have been sent to tell. But while the cameras saw light, what Kofi felt was something else, something heavier, quieter, and far more human. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Strangers reached out to touch his hand, as though he carried blessings in his skin. They asked about the river, about his mother, about how it felt to find her after all these years. Kofi smiled, nodded, answered politely, but deep inside, he carried an ache he couldn't name. The reunion had filled one hollow inside him, but it had opened another, because in every face that looked at him with wonder, he saw the truth that none of them wanted to admit. Miracles come with a price. He visited Abina often. Each trip back to the village was quieter, more personal. The camera crews eventually stopped following, realizing the spectacle had faded. But for Kofi, each visit felt like returning to the beginning of his own heartbeat. They would sit by the river at dusk, mother and son, saying little. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer full of distance. It was full of knowing. Sometimes Abina would reach for his hand, her fingers tracing the veins like one might trace a map. "You have the river in you," she would say softly. "That's why you never stopped moving." Once, he asked her, "Do you think it was meant to happen this way?" She smiled without answering. "The river doesn't ask why," she said. "It just flows where it must." He wanted to believe that everything, even the pain, had meaning. But at night, when he returned to the city and lay alone in his apartment, he sometimes dreamed again of the water, darker now, restless, whispering his name like a warning. Months passed. The story became a documentary, one he helped produce himself. He called it The River Remembers. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about fate, mothers, and the invisible threads that bind us to places we don't understand. The first time Abina saw it, she wept quietly. "You've given the river a voice," she said. "Now the world will know what it kept for us." But fame is a tide that never stays still. With it came curiosity, scrutiny, and questions that clawed at Kofi's peace. People claimed to have seen visions by the river, lights in the mist, the sound of a baby crying near the reeds. A few pilgrims even traveled to the village, bringing offerings, whispering prayers at the water's edge. The chief, now old and nearly blind, sent word to Kofi, "Your story has awakened something. The river is not a place for worship. It is a place for memory." Kofi returned soon after to calm the rising frenzy. The village had changed. Tourists, journalists, and seekers had disturbed the quiet rhythm that had lasted for generations. Abina's small hut now stood at the center of attention, strangers wanting to meet the Mother of Miracles. She endured it all with patience, though her eyes often drifted toward the river, uneasy. "They forget," she told him one evening, "that the river can take as easily as it gives." That night, a heavy rain began, the kind that didn't stop. By dawn, the river had swollen again, reaching the edges of the village. People whispered of omens. Some said it was the spirits reclaiming balance. Kofi tried to dismiss it as superstition, but when he stood by the bank and watched the water surge, he felt it a pulse, steady and alive, like a heartbeat beneath the current. "Do you hear it?" Abina asked beside him. He nodded, though it frightened him to admit he did. Days later, a government crew arrived to build barriers, to protect what had become a historical site. But Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that the river was restless for another reason. That night, he sat with Abina by the fire. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think it's calling me back." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "Maybe it wants you to remember who you are, not what they made you." The next morning, before sunrise, Kofi walked alone to the water. The mist curled around him like it had that morning 20 years ago. He knelt at the same bend where she had once found him, his reflection rippling beneath the surface. "You carried me once," he whispered to the river. "If you're still listening, tell me what I'm meant to do now." The wind stirred, lifting his words away. For a moment, it almost felt like an answer came back, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Keep telling the stories." Weeks later, his new documentary aired worldwide. It wasn't about miracles, this time. It was about mothers who lost children, about those who still searched rivers and roadsides hoping for return. It carried Abina's voice, raw and unpolished, speaking about love and sacrifice. "When the river brought him to me," she said in the film, "I thought I had saved a life. But maybe it was saving mine." Her words lingered long after the screen faded to black. That night, Kofi stood on the balcony of the studio, looking out at the lights of the city, flickering like distant stars. Somewhere beyond the skyline, he imagined the river, dark, endless, eternal. He closed his eyes and listened. In the quiet hum of the wind, he could almost hear her singing, the same lullaby she had once hummed over a basket on the water. And he realized something that would stay with him forever. The river had not only given him life, it had given him story. Years would pass before people stopped calling him the River Sun. Yet in every tale he told, every film he made, every story he helped bring to light, there was always an echo of that current, flowing beneath the words. And in the small village by the water, an old woman would smile whenever she heard his voice on the radio, whispering to herself, "He's still listening." The river no longer raged as it once did. It had grown quiet again, not in forgetfulness, but in peace. It had done its work. It had carried, and it had returned. And as dusk fell over the land, its surface glimmered softly under the fading sun, like a memory that refuses to die, flowing onward into forever. Fame, like the river, never stopped moving. It carried Kofi to places he had never imagined, cities with streets that glowed at night, rooms filled with applause, faces that smiled without truly seeing him. Every door seemed to open now at the sound of his name. He had become a symbol of hope, a headline, a man who embodied miracles, and yet, the more people celebrated him, the further he felt from the quiet simplicity that had once given his life meaning. He told himself he was doing good. His documentaries shone light on forgotten stories, the abandoned, the lost, the silenced. He won awards, shook hands with ministers and foreign dignitaries, gave speeches about destiny and resilience. But in the silence between his public moments, a quiet discontent began to whisper inside him. It was the same whisper he had once heard in his dreams, the murmur of the river, calling him back. Abina watched from afar as her son's world expanded beyond reach. She no longer saw him as often. When he came, it was for a few hurried days between flights and film sets. Each time he visited, he brought gifts, fabric from the city, medicines, new clothes, but she never asked for any of it. She only wanted time. "You are busy now," she said once, her tone soft, not accusing. "But remember, even the river must rest between rains." Kofi had smiled, not truly hearing her, and promised to return soon. He didn't. Months blurred into years. The world moved fast, and Kofi learned to keep up. He began to host international programs, his voice translated into languages he didn't speak. People admired his calm, his insight, his almost spiritual presence on screen. They didn't know it came from a wound that never quite healed. He would stand under bright studio lights, talking about human connection and destiny, while somewhere inside, he felt hollow. The river remained his anchor, at least in memory. Sometimes, during long flights, he would dream of it, not peaceful, but wild, restless. The water in his dreams grew darker, thicker, its sound no longer soothing but accusing. He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The next morning, he'd tell himself it was only stress, the mind's way of asking for rest. But something deeper in him knew, you cannot build a life on the story of your origin and then forget to honor it. One day, while filming along the coast of another country, he found himself drawn to a stretch of river that looked hauntingly familiar. He stood at its edge, the wind brushing through his coat, and for the first time in years, he removed his shoes, stepping barefoot into the water. It was colder than he remembered, sharper, the current wrapped around his ankles like a warning. "I haven't forgotten you," he whispered, though part of him knew that wasn't true. He had let the world's noise drown out the sound that once guided him. That evening, he received a call from the village, one that stopped him cold. Abina had fallen ill. The doctor's voice was careful, but the pause between his words said everything. Kofi felt the air leave his lungs. The next flight home was at dawn, but the hours in between stretched like an eternity. On the plane, he stared out at the darkness, the hum of the engine blending with the phantom sound of rushing water. He thought of every missed visit, every promise postponed, every moment he had traded for a headline. When he reached the village, it was near sunset. The sky burned with the color of copper and ash. Abina lay inside her hut, the same one where the river's story had found its beginning. She looked smaller, frailer than he remembered, but her eyes were clear. "You came," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The river told me you would." Kofi fell to his knees beside her, taking her hand in his. "I should have been here sooner," he said, tears already streaming. She smiled faintly. "The river doesn't measure time like we do. It only knows return." For days, he stayed by her side, leaving only to fetch water or help the healer. The villagers came to offer prayers, to whisper words of respect for the woman who had raised the boy from the river. Each night, Kofi told her stories from the city of the people he'd met, the lives he'd helped. "You've become what the river meant you to be," she said one evening. "You carry stories, like it carries rain. But remember, my son, even rivers dry when they forget their source." Those words lingered long after she fell asleep. Kofi sat outside under the stars, the river murmuring softly nearby. He watched the moon, reflected on its surface, broken, shimmering, beautiful. "I forgot," he whispered. "I let the world take me away from you, from this." The wind rose, gentle but insistent, and he thought he heard her lullaby carried across the water. Abina passed quietly at dawn. She was buried near the river, wrapped in the same shawl she had worn the morning she found him. The whole village came to say farewell. As the priest spoke, Kofi knelt by her grave, his fingers tracing the wet earth. The river behind him flowed steadily, indifferent and eternal. For the first time since childhood, He wept without restraint, not for the years lost, but for the silence that had grown between them. After the burial, he remained there long after everyone left. The sound of the river filled the air, not mournful, not angry, simply alive. He closed his eyes and listened, feeling the ground's coolness seep into his skin. "You carried me to her," he said softly, "and now, you've carried her away." The breeze shifted, brushing through the reeds, and for a moment, he felt her presence beside him, not as a ghost, but as a part of everything around him. When he finally rose, the sun was high, and the world felt lighter. He walked to the edge of the river, and let his reflection blur into the current. "I'll keep telling our story," he whispered, "but this time, I'll tell it right." Then he placed his hand on the water's surface, not to claim it, but to thank it. The current moved, gently beneath his palm, a soft, steady heartbeat answering his own. Back in the city, his next film was different. It wasn't about tragedy or miracles. It was about connection between people, between land, between what's lost and what's found. He ended it with his mother's voice, recorded years earlier. "The river doesn't forget. It waits until we're ready to listen." And when the credits rolled, the screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of water flowing, endless, alive. In that moment, millions watching across the world felt something they couldn't name, a quiet stirring, as if the river inside each of them had just awakened. The night of the live broadcast arrived with a kind of weight only destiny carries. The studio lights burned bright, but Kofi stood in the center of them like a shadow between worlds. It had been 6 months since Abina's passing, and though the world had moved on to other headlines, he still carried her voice like a prayer under his skin. This wasn't just another show. This was a farewell, a confession, and a promise all woven into one. The producers called it The River. And the word. They wanted it to be a reflective special. A closing chapter to the miracle that had once captured the nation's heart. But for Kofi, it was more personal. He had rewritten the script himself, cutting away every line that felt hollow, leaving only truth. As the crew took their places and the countdown began, he closed his eyes and whispered, "For you, Mama, for the river." The red light blinked on. "We are live in 3, 2, 1. The theme music faded, and the camera found his face. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, not awkward but sacred. The audience leaned closer, drawn in by something unseen. "When I was a child," he began softly, "I was told I came from the river, that I was found in water, carried by chance, saved by grace. For years, I thought that story belonged to me alone, but I've learned that the river doesn't belong to one person, it belongs to all of us." His voice wavered slightly, the memory pushing through the composure he had learned to wear like armor. "My mother, the woman who found me once, said that water remembers, that everything we lose returns when we are ready. I didn't understand her then, but I do now." He paused, looking directly into the lens, as if speaking to every unseen soul watching. "This isn't a story about miracles. It's a story about love, the kind that waits through storms and time, that endures silence, that forgives everything." Behind the glass, the crew grew still. The teleprompter scrolled on, but Kofi wasn't reading anymore. He was speaking from a place beyond script. "I thought I was saving the world by telling stories, but it was her story that saved me. My mother, Abina, taught me that love isn't something you earn, it's something you answer to. So tonight, I want to speak to her again, not as the man the world sees, but as the boy she found by the water." He swallowed hard, the air in the studio thick. "Wherever you are," he said, his voice breaking just enough to be real, "I hope you're watching, because I will keep telling our story until every forgotten child, every lost soul, knows that they are not alone." He lifted his eyes, and for a fleeting second, the lights reflected in them like stars. "You called me your son when no one else would, and even now, I still call you my mother." The broadcast room was silent. No one moved. The cameraman's hands trembled slightly as he zoomed out. It wasn't television anymore, it was testimony. When the program ended, there was no applause, no fanfare, only stillness. Then, across homes and cities, something extraordinary happened. People wept, not because they understood his exact pain, but because they recognized it, that deep, unspoken longing to belong, to be seen, to return home. By morning, messages flooded the network. Mothers called their estranged children. Families searched for those they had lost. Across the country, people gathered by rivers, lighting candles and letting them drift downstream in quiet remembrance. Kofi hadn't meant to start a movement, but he had. The world didn't just watch his story, they entered it. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in, interviews, conferences, humanitarian campaigns, but Kofi chose differently. He stepped away from the spotlight. The city that once echoed with his name now felt too loud, too shallow. He moved to the village again, to the place where it all began. The river greeted him as if no time had passed. Its waters were calmer now, its song softer. He built a small center near its banks, a school and shelter for children who had been abandoned, orphaned, or lost. He named it Abina House. Every morning, the children would gather outside to listen as he told them stories, not of wealth or fame, but of water, love, and forgiveness. He taught them that being lost doesn't mean being forgotten. The river doesn't reject what falls into it, he would say. It carries it until it finds home again. Some of the children would look up at him with wide eyes, clutching his hands, not knowing that they were sitting beside the man who had once been them. On the anniversary of Abina's passing, Kofi returned to her grave by the water. He carried a small wooden carving, a replica of the one she had once made of him as a baby. He placed it gently on the earth and whispered, "The story isn't finished, Mama, it never will be." The wind stirred the reeds, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard her voice, warm, steady, carried by the current. "You've done well, my son." The sky that evening was painted gold and violet. The river reflected it all, every color, every shimmer of light. Kofi sat by the bank until darkness fell, his reflection merging with the water. He no longer feared the current, he understood it now. Life, like the river, doesn't stop, it bends, it returns, it reminds. And when the world spoke his name again, as they always did, it was no longer with the tone of awe or curiosity. It was with quiet reverence, for in his story, people found their own. They began to believe again, not in miracles, but in mercy, in memory, in the gentle truth that sometimes, the things we lose aren't gone, they're only waiting for us to be ready to find them. That night, as he drifted to sleep beside the sound of flowing water, the moonlight brushed across his face, and somewhere in the distance, a baby's faint cry echoed, not of pain this time, but of peace. The circle had turned once more. The river remembered, and in remembering, it set everything free, to be continued.